Right now, there are more chickens on this planet than there are humans, dogs, cats, and cows combined. Roughly 3 chickens for every single person alive. Over 20 billion of them, walking around right now, today. And here's the part that should stop you. Humans consume somewhere between 80 and 90 billion chickens every single year. Not alive at once, consumed annually. No other animal in human history has ever been produced or eaten at anything close to that scale. So how did that happen? How did one small, twitchy jungle bird from Southeast Asia become the most numerous bird species that has ever existed on Earth, more common than every wild bird species combined, in any era, ever? The obvious answer is food. Humans needed protein. Chickens provided it. End of story. Except that's not what happened at all. The real explanation is far stranger, and it starts with a bird nobody would have guessed would end up ruling the planet. Around 8,000 years ago, deep in the jungles of what's now Southeast Asia, there lived a bird called the red jungle fowl. It was small, jumpy, and spent most of its life hiding in trees to avoid predators. Nothing about it looked destined for greatness. But here's where it gets strange. For decades, historians assumed early humans domesticated this bird for the obvious reason: meat, eggs, dinner. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Some of the earliest evidence of humans keeping these birds close doesn't come from kitchens. It comes from ritual sites and from cockfighting arenas. What almost nobody realizes is that humans may have first valued this bird for spectacle and symbolism, not survival. Food came later, almost as an afterthought. Once humans started keeping junglefowl close, something began that would take thousands of years to fully play out. The birds spread along trade routes, into China, into India, into the Middle East, eventually reaching Egypt, Greece, and Rome. By the time of the Roman Empire, chickens were common enough that Roman generals used them to predict the outcomes of military campaigns, reading omens in how eagerly the birds ate their feed. An empire, at times, making war decisions based on the appetite of a bird. But none of that explains 20 billion chickens today. The real transformation, the one that turned a jungle bird into a global phenomenon, didn't happen in ancient Rome. It happened far more recently and far more deliberately. And it starts with an unfair fight, because if you line a chicken up next to almost any other livestock animal, it stops looking like food and starts looking like a machine. Cows take years to mature and consume enormous amounts of feed for the meat and milk they produce. Pigs are efficient, but can't lay eggs and need significant space. Sheep and goats reproduce slowly and yield relatively little meat for what they consume. Chickens solve nearly every one of these problems at once. They reach maturity in weeks, not years. A single hen can lay an egg almost every single day, a renewable protein source that costs the animal nothing. Pound for pound, chickens convert feed into protein more efficiently than almost any farmed animal on the planet, using a fraction of the land and water cattle require. In other words, chickens aren't just convenient. They're close to optimal, a livestock animal that seems almost engineered for human needs, even though evolution had no idea humans were coming. That efficiency quietly turned chickens into one of the most important pillars of global food security. In places where land is too scarce or cattle too expensive, chickens fill the gap. They're often the very first livestock a low-income family can afford, a steady source of protein and a small but real source of income. Development organizations have repeatedly pointed to small-scale poultry farming as one of the most effective tools for lifting families out of poverty. Not because chickens are glamorous, because they're brutally efficient at turning a small investment into survival. If you're enjoying uncovering the hidden stories behind everyday things, consider subscribing. There's a lot more hiding in plain sight. If feeding billions of people were the end of the story, chickens would already be remarkable. But food turns out to be only half the story, because chickens quietly became essential to something far less expected: modern medicine. For decades, one of the most common methods for producing vaccines has involved chicken eggs. Many flu vaccines are still grown inside fertilized eggs, using them as natural incubators for the viruses used to build immunity. Billions of doses over decades, made possible by a bird most people think of only as dinner. Chickens have also become one of the most genetically studied animals on Earth. in part because their fast reproductive cycle lets scientists observe multiple generations in the time it would take to study a single generation of a larger animal. And then there's the transformation that happened inside the chicken itself. The bird your grandparents ate looked almost nothing like the one on supermarket shelves today. Starting in the mid-20th century, selective breeding programs began optimizing chickens with startling precision for faster growth, larger breast meat, higher feed efficiency. Wild junglefowl hens laid around 10 to 15 eggs a year. Modern hens can lay over 300. In just a few decades, the broiler chicken was reaching market weight in a fraction of the time it once took, turning chicken from an occasional luxury into one of the cheapest sources of protein on Earth. That transformation came with real trade-offs, questions about animal welfare that researchers and the industry are still grappling with today. But its effect on the world was undeniable. Chicken became the most consumed meat on the planet, overtaking beef and pork, not because people suddenly craved it more, but because it had quietly become the most efficient protein humans had ever engineered. Here's one more thing that should unsettle you a little. Genetically, chickens are among the closest living relatives of Tyrannosaurus rex. Every time you've seen a chicken peck at the ground, you are looking at one of the nearest living descendants of the most feared predator in Earth's history, now standing in a backyard, eating corn. Which brings us to an unsettling question. What would actually happen if chickens disappeared? The honest answer is catastrophic, and not in an abstract way. Picture supermarket shelves emptying of the cheapest protein hundreds of millions of people rely on. Picture prices for every remaining meat source spiking as demand shifts overnight. Picture vaccine manufacturers scrambling to find alternative production methods for shots the world depends on every flu season. Picture millions of small farmers, many of them women in rural communities who manage household flocks, losing the one reliable source of income keeping their families afloat. The ripple effects wouldn't stay contained to dinner plates. They'd touch nutrition, medicine, and economies on nearly every continent, almost simultaneously. It's a strange kind of power for a creature almost nobody thinks twice about, the descendant of a shy jungle bird that once hid in trees to survive, now quietly holding up pieces of modern civilization most people never notice. History tends to remember empires, inventions, revolutions. We build monuments to kings and scientists and conquerors. But some of the most important forces in human history were never crowned or celebrated. They were simply useful, over and over, for thousands of years, until the world quietly became unable to function without them. The chicken never asked for that role. It never fought a war or built an empire. It just kept laying eggs, kept feeding people, kept showing up, generation after generation, until an entire civilization was standing on its back without ever noticing.